This is a Squiz podcast. We're your shortcut to being informed. This week, our podcast is brought to you by BHP. Reducing greenhouse gas emissions in the production of copper is critical. That's why BHP has committed to solar, wind and battery agreements to help power their copper mine at Olympic Dam in South Australia. It's happening now at BHP. Visit bhp.com/critical to find out more. Weekly Wrap is the week in news and what's coming up. I'm Kate Watson.
And I'm Larissa Moore.
Larissa Moore.
I know, it's been a while.
It's been so long since you did a podcast. Too long since you did a podcast. Long-time listeners of the Squiz will remember you from Squiz Today. You had a baby, then you had another baby. You're back at work, but not behind the mic regularly.
No, an early morning podcast doesn't really work with two small babies, but I make a cameo every now and then, and Claire's chuffed off to Thailand drinking cocktails, so I'm in the hot seat.
There you go. I'm glad to have you. Thank you for doing it. To the news of the week. This week, the biggest story has been about violence against women. Between a moment our Prime Minister had at a rally to nearly $1 billion worth of funding, we'll navigate the week for you on that one.
Yeah, we sure will. And then we will get into a segment that you've named news stories that took a bit to wrap our heads around. I do love your segment names. They're always a bit creative.
Thank you.
It involves the fallout from elections in the Solomon Islands, a recce of what's going on in university campuses in the US and now here in Australia, and quantum computing.
In what's coming up, it's the Met Gala and Musk v the Aussie government. Let's do it. We're doing something different at the top this week. It's always good to mix it up. Our News Club topic this week was faster fashion. It was all about fast fashion, the associated problems and the impact of new e-commerce sites like Temu and Shein on the fashion ecosystem. In the newsletter that went out, Larissa, we asked Squizzes, do you consider things like the environment and or ethical production when buying new clothes? We're here today to report back on what you told us.
Such a good topic. And before we get into the survey results, I have to tell you, I was totally de-influenced to buy something by the episode. I have a hens this weekend and I was all going to buy a dress to suit the theme. And then I was like, no,
I'm not going to do that. Do you really need it?
Correct. I asked that question and the answer was no.
That if you've listened to the interview with Lauren Sams, you'll know what we're referring to. If you haven't,
get onto it.
Give it a listen.
Yeah, so you interviewed Lauren Sams. She's the fashion editor at the Australian Financial Review. The results of that poll, 36% said that the environment and or ethical production was a really big consideration, but there were some other good takeouts too.
Yeah, plenty of our audience having a real focus on buying Aussie-made clothing. So many also trying to buy secondhand. That was an overwhelming sort of sentiment that I didn't expect. More than half say, though, that they weigh up the ethics amongst other considerations. Here's a few quotes. I can't stand Temu and Shein, but at least you know where their ethics lie. It's other retailers when it's not so obvious. That's my concern, and I would love to consider ethics and the environment more in my clothes purchases, but living in a small country town and not liking boho-style fashions leaves my options limited.
I come from a small town. I know what those boho styles are. That's a fair enough point. 10% said the cheaper the better. Some on pensions were saying it's all about affordability, which is another interesting perspective. Here was a considerate take. I think it's easier for me to consider the ethical, environmental issues as I'm nearing retirement, so we'll need more relaxed clothing and fewer outfits for social and work events. It means I can afford to buy less but better quality. It is more difficult when you're younger and need to dress to impress on a limited budget.
A point well made. Really interesting snapshot. Thank you to anyone who participated in that poll. And yeah, we found that topic really fascinating. To the biggest story of the week, Larissa, the news has really been dominated by this never-ending, seemingly, issue of violence against women. Last weekend, we saw rallies around the country attended by thousands of people. And that's because so far this year, one woman has been killed every 4 days in gender-motivated violent attacks. That's more frequent than last year.
Yeah, and if you look across the last decade or so, the number bounces around, but end of the day, it's not improving.
That's right. On Wednesday, there was a meeting of National Cabinet convened to talk specifically about how our governments can tackle this problem. Out of that came a nearly $1 billion announcement to address the issues.
Yeah, $925 million to be exact, and that'll be allocated over 5 years. Some of it will go to permanently establishing the Leaving Violence program, and I say permanently established because it's something that was being trialled. It's now going to become a permanent thing. It means those fleeing problematic relationships will receive $5,000 in financial support as well as access to services.
quite a bit of criticism of that announcement because it won't start until mid-2025. Plenty saying the frontline services need more resourcing as a priority right now. And then you also have the likes of Rosie Batty, who of course is a real leader in this space, saying she hopes this payment is easily accessible and provided without the victim having to prove or go through an extensive screening process that ultimately re-traumatizes them. That's her quote. That's because it can be quite difficult to meet all the criteria for the funds.
Yeah, she also said that leaving a violent relationship is a long recovery. Violence doesn't necessarily stop just because you leave. The other thing that came out of the meeting was an announcement of legislation to ban deepfake pornography online. So that's where anyone who shares sexually explicit material made by artificial intelligence could be subjected to criminal penalties.
That's an announcement of legislation, and it's important to point that out. So that has to go through Parliament before it can actually happen. They also have $6.5 million set aside to test out online age assurance or age verification technology. What that tech does is verify and estimate the age of an internet user to prevent them from accessing inappropriate material online. Both of the above are some of the many things that people are saying are contributing to disrespectful attitudes towards women. The other word that was thrown around that I must confess I'd never heard before was doxing, outlawing doxing.
Yeah, I wasn't across this one either, but doxing is intentionally placing someone's identity, private information, or personal details online without their consent. It's a problem not just for victims of family violence, but more broadly too. These announcements were just one part of the news this week. The other was a call for men to participate more in these conversations.
Plenty of high-profile women pleading with men they know to participate in this and be part of the solution. And then there's also the question of supporting the perpetrators and how and whether they can be rehabilitated. Also, big problems with the judicial system.
Yeah, so many asking why these alleged murderers are out on bail. Kate, a question that was doing rounds on social media, we were talking about this just before. Women are answering a hypothetical question of, if you are alone in the woods, would you rather confront a bear or a man? A lot of women are answering bear, and a lot of men are finding that really shocking.
And we called this out because you might see it on your social media feeds and you might see it in conversation over the coming weeks. I think it started in the US actually, but it's starting to get some traction here. What many are saying is that the difference in the approach to this answer is being touted as an example of the disconnect between how women perceive this issue and how men perceive this issue. As we wrap this one up, if you or anyone you know is affected, you can get help by calling 1-800-RESPECT. All right, on we go, Larissa, straight into a segment I have called, as you said at the top, news stories this week that took us a little bit to get our heads around.
And look, if you haven't done a podcast for a while, that's a lot of news stories, Kate, but it's good to know you made it particularly difficult for me this week.
If it's not complicated, it's not worth it, Larissa. I think that's how we approach things here at Weekly Wrap. Let's kick off with quantum computing.
Oh, why not? Just some easy listening for your Saturday morning. Go on.
I think Alice said on Squiz Today this week that she'd seen something about it a few weeks ago, but when the $1 billion investment number was dropped, her interest was piqued.
Fair enough. $1 billion is a lot of money. That money was announced by the federal and Queensland governments, so they're roughly going to go half and half in that investment. It's part of the Future Made in Australia policy. It's an investment in a Silicon Valley-based startup called PsiQuantum, and they want to build the first commercially useful quantum computer in Brisbane. Let's start off easy. Kate, what is quantum computing?
Easy peasy, broad brush strokes. Quantum computing is a computer that uses advanced physics to solve problems that are too complex for a regular computer. So, this is what I've learned. If a normal computer was doing a puzzle, it would need to solve it one piece at a time. Does this piece fit? Yes or no? Move on to the next one. If a quantum computer was doing a puzzle, it could look at all the pieces at once, consider all the possible options, and solve the puzzle instantly. So, it's a lot about speed.
That explanation makes perfect sense.
Thank you.
Well done, tick. Scientists reckon it can help do things like discover new medicines, crack codes. You were on the Squiz Today podcast a couple of times this week, Kate, filling in. You talked about how the government have set aside money to research how quantum computing could help organise even the logistics of the 2032 Brisbane Olympics.
I liked that example because it seems
it's real,
tangible, practical.
Yeah.
I can kind of get my head around that. It's being called, I think the Queensland Treasurer perhaps called it our Apollo, our moonshot. It's not without criticism. PsiQuantum, you mentioned briefly, has Aussie founders, but it's a US company. It's based in Silicon Valley. So whilst they'll have a base in Brisbane, that's part of the deal, there are questions about whether a US company should have custody of an Australian technology and whether it really does speak to the objective of future made in Australia if the company is US based. Also, the opposition both federally and in Queensland are concerned about the lack of detail around the agreement and how the agreement came to be.
There's also a Queensland state election and a federal election due in the coming years, so who knows, a change of leadership could put that funding in question. But back to quantum computing, I reckon you should try and get Kathy Foley, our chief scientist, onto News Club to give it a crack at explaining it even better.
I was thinking that, and I was also reminded that Michelle Simmons, our Australian of the Year from...
2018?
2018,
yeah,
something like that, was all about quantum computing. So maybe we'll try for her.
Couple of smart ladies. Let's get them on.
Shoot for the stars?
Yeah.
The moonshot?
The moonshot?
Oh, God.
Let's leave that there. Moving on. Moving right on to an election in the Solomon Islands.
Yeah, we wanted to call this one out because they have a new Prime Minister locked in. There's a lot of eyes watching what will happen in terms of their relationship with China.
Let's do the new Prime Minister first, Jeremiah Manele. He was the Foreign Minister in former PM Manasseh Sogavare's government. He became the leader of the Our party when Sogavare stepped down. Despite only winning 15 of the 50 seats in Parliament, he was elected PM in a secret ballot on Thursday.
I kind of got a little bit interested in how the politics works, but then I thought it actually doesn't matter that much at this point because we know who it is.
Yeah.
3 days ago, it would have been important to explain the process, but we've got a Prime Minister locked in now. The real focus, as I mentioned, is on what the change of leader will mean for relations in the Pacific.
By which you mean China.
Yeah. China. It was former Prime Minister Manasseh Sogavare who signed a security pact in 2022 with China. This word security pact gets talked about a lot in the news, like we all know what it means. It's kind of a bit secret, actually. Essentially what it does is put a Chinese military presence in our neighbourhood.
And there's been a lot of interest then over what a potential change of government or a leader would mean for these geopolitical relations that are on our doorstep. Long story short, Manele's indicated that the security pact will remain. He's also told the ABC that Australia and China were equally important international partners for the Solomon Islands and that he was going to pursue a foreign policy of friends to all, enemies to none. So nothing drastic, but good to understand.
No drastic changes is what you mean. Always good to understand. The final story that took a bit to wrap our heads around this week, and if I'm honest, still taking a bit to wrap my head around, is these protests happening in college campuses in the US. Some commentators, Larissa, are calling it the biggest wave of US student activism since the Black Lives Matter movement in 2020.
Yeah, and it's really stepped up to the later end of last week. Some pretty intense scenes with police in riot gear removing and arresting hundreds of protesters from these college campuses. Some of the pro-Palestinian protesters have had encampments set up since April, so it has been going on for a little while. They're calling for a ceasefire, but they're also calling for universities to cut financial ties with Israeli companies.
Yeah, they're happening, as you say, across the US. There are now some encampments also being set up at Australian universities as well, so the University of Sydney, the University of Melbourne and others. Back to protests in the US though, it's putting pressure on President Joe Biden, who's trying to walk a line between supporting students' right to protest. So it's this never-ending right to free speech conversation in the US. But there's also this issue of, well, is it lawful? Is it anti-Semitic being the major sticking point? So it is becoming a real domestic issue for him.
You had a really good recommendation for me, Kate, a podcast episode by The Daily. It's one that really focuses on what's going on in Columbia University.
I might be at my cap for recommendations of the Daily podcast for this year even, but this episode steps through how the leaders of these universities are trying to appeal to Congress to show they're taking action against anti-Semitic views, but by doing so, they're agitating and inflaming pro-Palestinian protesters. There's quite a bit of backstory to it. So if you're interested in going a little bit deeper on this one, I'll put that link in your episode notes. Before we get into what might be in the news next week, a message from our podcast advertiser, BHP. This week, they're keen to share with Squizzes how the resources they mine are key to the energy transition to renewable energy.
Yeah, we often hear about the push towards renewable energy, but what doesn't get as much attention is the role resources play in making that transition possible. Take steel, for instance. It's a key material used in the construction of renewable energy infrastructure, as well as in bridges, transportation, hospitals and schools. And a big part of it comes from iron ore.
BHP says the importance of responsibly produced Australian iron ore is clear.
And by that, they mean reducing the greenhouse gas emissions associated with iron ore production. It's why BHP has committed to a solar and battery agreement to help power their port facilities at Port Hedland.
It's happening now at BHP, and if you want to learn more, visit bhp.com/critical. You'll find that link in your episode notes. Each episode of Weekly Wrap, we talk about the week coming up in news. We try to get you ahead of things. Monday is a public holiday for those in the Northern Territory and Queensland. Lucky you guys. It's also the first anniversary of King Charles being crowned.
Has not been an easy year for him, but he's made his first official appearance this week after having the last 3 months off to focus on his cancer treatment. He announced that cancer diagnosis back in February. February was also the last time Prince Harry was in the UK, but he's going to be coming back next week.
That'll be in the news,
Yeah,
of course,
for sure.
Whenever Prince Harry goes back to the UK. That's a news story. He'll be in London to attend a ceremony marking the 10th anniversary of the Invictus Games. Tuesday, decision day for the RBA and interest rates.
And lucky you've brought it up because it's not on the first Tuesday of every month now.
No,
But
it's not. It's like 8 times a year, whatever it is.
It's so confusing.
Yeah,
but it's happening this Tuesday.
It is
coming
happening
up.
this Tuesday.
Most reckon rates are going to stay where they are.
And whilst we're on the topic of the economy, it's also the day that our Squiz Kids team will release a Q&A episode with Treasurer Jim Chalmers.
It's so good. I've had a cheeky listen. The kids of Australia are asking the questions. The Treasurer has to answer them. My personal favourite is when he's asked about whether he's happy being the schoolyard equivalent of vice captain.
You'll have to listen for the answer.
The
We're not going to
leadership-
give it away, but the leadership conversation from kids is interesting. It's, of course, Squiz Kids, our family news podcast for kids aged between 7 to 12 years old. Just search for it in your podcast app. Wednesday is the start of the Eurovision Song Contest.
It's been 50 years since ABBA won that contest with their song Waterloo. Kate, you asked if Australia was in Eurovision this year during our production meeting. A couple of shocked faces on the team.
That did not go down well. Turns out we have a few big Eurovision fans. I've since found out that the pop duo Electric Fields will represent Australia with their song One Milkalai. I think that's how you say it. It's a bit of a dance bop. We'll put a link to it in your episode notes if you want to have a listen. And if you're keen to watch them perform, 5 a.m. I don't know if they'll be the ones performing at 5 a.m. I don't know exactly when they're performing, but 5 a.m.
Coverage
Eastern
kicks
time
off.
On SBS, coverage kicks off.
What a way to start your day.
Done my
Eurovision.
homework. Yeah.
Sticking with the cultural theme, maybe at the other end of the spectrum, Thursday is the Australian Book Industry Awards. A couple of Aussie books on the shortlist, including Homecoming by Kate Morton, Green Dot by Madeline Gray, and The Bookbinder of Jericho by Pip Williams.
Have you read any of them?
Nope. But I do like Kate Morton, so I want to check that one
I've
out.
read Green Dot and I've read The Bookbinder of Jericho by Pip Williams.
Hey, go
yeah, I
you.
know. Go me. Who knew?
God, I've got to catch up.
On Friday, the e-safety commissioner and ex are back in court arguing over those videos on social media platform that show the 15th of April stabbing attack on Sydney Bishop Mari Emanuel.
Yeah, you and Claire talked about this in last week's episode. Just to give it a bit of a recap, the e-safety commissioner, Julie Inman-Grant, has ordered Musk and X to remove 65 tweets containing the video. That's for extreme violence and terrorism reasons. Instead of removing them, the platforms just hid them from Australian users only at the moment. Grant's gone to court. They've ordered Musk to hide these videos from users globally or face a pretty hefty fine for each day they're up. But this is all pending a hearing now on the 10th of May.
10th of May being Friday. In and amongst all of that, our Home Affairs Minister Claire O'Neill said that just about every problem we have as a country is exacerbated by social media. We mentioned that last week on the Weekly Wrap, and we asked people who are listening on Spotify to take a poll about whether they agree or not with that statement. 83% of those who responded agree.
That is a pretty high number. Social media is a bit on the nose.
Squiz recommends this week Met Gala away. We missed the Met Gala in what's coming up. Thank God you're on the podcast this week, Larissa, because we would have missed it entirely.
It's like my holy grail of a day. When it comes to red carpets, there's none better than the Met Gala. It's the annual fundraiser for the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. One giant fashion show. The theme this year is Sleeping Beauties, Reawakening Fashion. It's being hosted by Chris Hemsworth, Zendaya, J-Lo, Bad Bunny. Not too sure who Bad Bunny is, but sure. My recommendations is the 2016 documentary, The First Monday in May. It looks at how the 2015 Met Gala came together. So it's a bit old now, but it's good if you want to just delve into the fashion. There's lots of Anna Wintour. It was the year that Rihanna wore that giant yellow dress. Do you remember it?
I'm like, you're looking at me and my face is blank. Entertainment is my blind spot. I do not remember that.
A million memes. It looked like a giant egg omelette on the stairs. Not ringing a bell.
I don't know what you're talking about.
Right. I'll put it in your episode notes. I'll show you later. What's your recommendation?
Oh, you won't be shocked that my recommendation is
Daily?
no, it's not The Daily, but it nearly is. New York Times have a new podcast series called The Interview. They launched with 2 episodes. One is an interview with Anne Hathaway. I didn't listen to that one.
I had a crack at listening to it.
Okay. And?
Yeah.
It's odd, isn't it?
It's odd.
Yeah, I've heard. This is what I was looking at some commentary about.
Her
it, saying
answers are odd.
It's a bit odd. So you might want to listen to that one. But the other one they did and that I did listen to in full was the one with Yair Lapid. He's the opposition leader in Israel. So you can see they're doing, very broad guests. I thought it was a brilliant interview. They have this interesting concept where they do the interview and then they check back in with the guest in a couple of days or a couple of weeks to see if they've reflected on anything that they've said. They're sort of given a chance to clarify, and I thought that was a really interesting way to do it.
I had a listen on your recommendation. It does get a bit heated, and then when they come back after this time, they're both reflecting on sort of why they reacted like that in the interview. So super interesting one to have a listen to.
All of the links to all of our recommendations throughout this podcast are in your episode notes and also always on our Instagram page at the Squiz News Club. Squiz Press, Larissa, your actual job at the Squiz is not a podcast host. We all have actual jobs and then podcasting jobs.
Occasional podcast hosts.
You're actually the head of growth and engagement. With that hat on, the mic is yours.
I'm on here. I want to bang the drum for our newsletters. Obviously, I'm head of growth, so I want lots of people to sign up, but they're genuinely amazing. So get onto it. Get your friends onto them. News Club, Squiz Today, Shortcuts newsletters. They're packed so full of information. They're right there in your inbox. They're super easy to forward to your mates if you want to get them across something. These days, lots of people get their news from social media. It's something that you and Claire have talked about a lot when it comes to the potential of Meta removing news publishers from Instagram. Lots of conversations about how people are getting their news, and I've got to just throw the newsletters into the mix. So if you're talking to your mates about where they get their news and how they do it, give a plug for the Squiz Today newsletters. Go to our website, thesquiz.com.au, sign up, get them in your inbox, all good.
And if you just like Larissa,
it
helps her with her KPIs.
Correct.
So do it for Larissa. To that end, you'll be back with us next week. Claire is continuing to sip cocktails in Koh Samui, having a well-earned break. So you will hear from Larissa next week.
Could be back next week.
Kate Watson, co-host of News Club and The Weekly Wrap, jumping in here to say thank you for listening to our podcasts first and foremost. And if you like them, we'd really appreciate it if you could share them. Tell your mates about us. Tell your family. Tell your barista. Tell your hairdresser. Whoever you think might be interested in the news that we cover. You telling people about us is still the number one way we grow. Thanks in advance.